lot. And so.
John Thorpe, good morning. Hey. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. You know, you gotta go to Chattanooga, you know you live sour.
I do.
Yeah, okay. When you gotta be there?
There were 5.
Okay.
But I gotta check into a hotel and I totally forgotten that this is bond that weekend. So I think encounter a little bit of traffic.
Oh, you sure will.
Do you know what a Bonnaroo is? Bonnaroo is a big music festival, sort of like Woodstock
Yeah.
in Manchester. And it's kind of like just right off the interstate. I used to call it the first heritage of Bonnaroo. And folks, we've got one guy in the country, not far from me, every year, and he buys a couch at Goodwill, takes it and sets the couch up. Yeah, Cullen Douglas. So.
Reliving his young morning.
How was was it tennis in St. Louis?
Little Rock.
Little Rock, okay.
We didn't lose again. We didn't play.
I know. It's all that we frame it, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I figured this chapter might put people off, so
No, it's really wonderful.
yeah. Well, and the way, you know, I was wondering where he was going with where she was going with the title. And that final quote is just great.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I just read it.
Yeah, so couple of things before we get going. Somebody suggested that our beginning where I was going around and having everybody tell their name and all of that was overdone, and we didn't need that. And I did tell them that the history of some of that is the first half hour when we did the Bible group was we just visit and catch up and sign cards and things like that. And that the class didn't really start until 10. But I think we can go ahead and modify that a little bit. And my reason for doing that the first couple of weeks is, first of all, I think it's important you all know one another. And secondly, I anticipated that in the first couple of weeks, we would have people who hadn't been here a couple of times joining us. And I know that there are a fair number of people who've been here the last 2 weeks who can't be here today. So that's just how it is. And I expect that's how it's going to be for the whole summer. So I don't have anticipation that that's going. But to start out, before we actually get into the book proper, a couple of things. First, did any of you take the opportunity or the time to watch the clips that I sent you about Billy Sunday?
Yes. I watched
What do you think? Do you want me to teach standing on the chair? I mean, unbelievable. And I do think that, you know, he certainly had a gift at connecting with people who the church had not touched. And as I said last week, one of those people was my grandfather, who had worked all his life with men. He was a tradesman. He worked in quarries for the most part, and probably knew a little bit about the rough side of life in the midst of all of that. My dad said, you know, his experience, is somebody trying to come in?
Yeah.
I get it. Thanks, Emily, or John, or Susie, or one of y'all. But my dad had older siblings. He had a brother who was 16 years older, a sister who was 14 years older, or something like that. And then he lost an older brother who was an infant during the Great Influenza. And then Pop was 21. But my dad's experience of his father in church, and therefore the whole family in church, was radically different than his older siblings. Now, unfortunately, I never really met them. My cousin, my uncle John, died when I was 3, I think. And my aunt Mildred, died in 47 or 48 in childhood. And therefore, I only sort of know all of this. And then my grandfather died in 41, my grandmother when I was an anyway, so that was the one thing I was going to raise. I just thought seeing that and hearing that story, and if you've never done any study around the what is it, 19th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol, which is, you know, wrong in certain ways to figure that out. But the animus behind that, the motivation behind that, was the absolute destruction of so many families during that period. So I'm fairly certain that didn't go well. And of course, then it brought prohibition, and prohibition brought people, you know, like Al Capone. And one of my members of my church in Libertyville, Illinois, grandfather was General Dawes, who was head of the Chicago Fed, who brought in Elliot Ness to suppress Al Capone. I mean, it's just, you know, kind of interesting, all of these, you know, things. You do one thing and there's a counter movement in all of that. The other thing I wanted to bring up before we actually got into the book, are you all following what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention? Yeah, I tried to print off a couple of articles. I didn't get a chance. The New York Times is doing really fine reportage of it. For those who don't know, the SBC voted to disunion, what's the word, disaffiliate, basically kick out. Well, basically, excommunicate, but it's a different word than that. For congregation, and then individual pastors over women's ordination. And
One church is in Kentucky.
one church is in Kentucky. The woman who has served it has been there 30-some years. And one of the other churches is Saddleback, which is, you know, any way you want to cut it, a pretty remarkable and strongly evangelical church. So, you know, what's going on here? And I think some of the arguments are dovetailing with some of the stuff that we're reading. And what is it that's causing this anxiety within that particular Christian community over this? And a lot of them are saying, well, this is, you know, it's sort of like the Vietnam argument, but the domino effect. You let women in, pretty soon you're gonna have gays, pretty soon you're gonna have gay marriage, pretty soon, you know, all of that. And so it's really kind of interesting to see how all of that came about. Carol?
Yes, I spoke out at Emmanuel Baptist the other day, and to their senior citizens group, and I'd spoken out there last year for some Wednesday night. I did a Wednesday night series on history of religion and anyway, I knew I met their male pastor, but a woman came up to me afterwards and said, "I want to introduce myself. I'm XYZ. I'm the assistant pastor here," which I thought was very interesting. And Glendale Baptist, which is over there across from what used to be Monroe Harding, they have, and I think they have a co-pastorate of 2 women over there. And the funny thing about the Southern Baptist Convention defrocking the union, the Saddleback Church and this other church, is that Baptists are congregational.
Right.
Presbyterians have decency and good order. You can be, and you can preach anything you want in a Baptist church. So the irony of the SBC doing this, which is just sort of like a link of friendship, so to speak.
In fact, I read an article, or at least a letter, that Rick Warren had written, who is the pastor of the Saddleback Church, that was basically this defense of historic principle of Baptist, that, it's basically the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And that's the only creed we have, and if you can get on with that, you can be part of us in this work of evangelism. And, of course, the brethren, we're not buying that. And, I did also read that, some potential pushback has been, a number of women who were really pressing hard, the former head of the SBC, holding his feet on the fire on, some issues around, crossing boundaries around sexuality. And that, we're just nipping in the bud, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down, you're rocking the boat kind of a deal. Yeah.
It seems to me that a lot of the differences in churches relate a little bit to education. And sometime if you could go through what it means to be a minister or a pastor in different churches,
Sure.
particularly the evangelical church.
Sure.
What does somebody have to do to become a pastor of the church? My impression is, I'd say, I want to get up there and preach, and if everybody lets me, I can do it.
Yeah. I would say that there was a time where that was particularly perhaps true. But I think it is much more complicated and contextual now. And I do think our book starts to point to this, the post-war GI generation being able to go to school. All of a sudden, we saw a rise in the evangelical communities into education, into all of these things. So there are folks who are incredibly well educated, but just see things in very different ways. When I was at seminary, we had some incredibly gifted kids who were out of the Church of Christ. They'd gone to Abilene. What is the school out of Abilene? Abilene Christian College, which is, and I mean, you want to talk about knowing their Testament, and they were really good, right? We had a professor of New Testament, Jimmy Jack McGee Roberts, who was an Old Testament professor. And a lot of these guys came to study with Jimmy Jack as well. And so, in some ways, I would argue they were better educated, especially on, biblical languages than the facility I have. I'm not a gifted linguist. I've studied 7 languages and I've not mastered any, including English. But these guys came in, knowing their creed, knowing their Hebrew already, but they still had this view, and some of them with inerrancy, and with the underlying understanding of the Bible. But I think within the SBC, one of the things that I would want to say is really that, a great swath of what it means, and that there are probably some folks who mount the pulpit when they're 16 with no training, but some people think they've got the gift of the Spirit with them. And then there are other folks who have more degrees than I do.
But if I'm not wrong, you're a Presbyterian, there's
Oh, absolutely, yeah, within the
steps we
Presbyterian
have
church,
to
right.
take to go through.
Right.
And is that true of the Baptists or the Methodists or the Lutherans?
I think it is true with most of the main lines, and but they're different. I mean, as far as I know, we're the only denomination that still requires all of the clergy to have passed Greek and Hebrew. So that's kind of one step. There are other denominations that don't require any of that, but and within some of the evangelical communities, I think it is as you suggest. But I would want to say that the levels of education by denomination that used to be very true prior to the Second World War. I mean, there were major books kind of written about sort of the socioeconomic strata you were if you were in different denominations, right? you know, kind of Episcopalians are at one level, and then maybe Presbyterians and, you know, Presbyterians and Baptists who can read, you know, there are all those kind of jokes that were there. And there was some truth to that, but it's not completely true. And the reason I like Rick Warren's piece so much is because I do think we need to kind of acknowledge and honor that within certain traditions, there is also a deep commitment to education. Like some of you are getting to know Bill Wilson, who is working with us in our vision program. Bill grew up at Brentwood Baptist Church. His dad was the founding pastor of that. And he is a very well-educated guy. So I don't want to make blanket statements about stuff. Yeah.
Well, when I received patients, I had a lot of, I was surprised at how many of my patients in rural counties were lay ministers, what they call them, so they had full-time jobs.
Right.
And I don't think they were Presbyterians, or they were more evangelist or fundamentalist or whatever, but they, in small churches, way out.
Right.
And
And I think that is speaking to Ken's point. And my wife works with a woman whose husband, Red, is a Church of Christ pastor, who has not had, you know, a lick of any education,
yeah,
college or seminary.
yeah, these weren't even college graduates.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say, Liberty University is very Baptist, very evangelical, and it just churns and churns people out into ministry. And I have, you know, in communities worked alongside people from there who are really bright and great to work with, even though it's not my favorite organization. But as they are churning and educating people, the expectation of education is growing in some of those traditions where it wasn't necessarily expected before.
Mary?
One of the terms that jumped out at me yesterday in the coverage of the convention was complementarian.
Yeah,
And there it was that
right.
they believe that men and women are called to separate roles
Right.
in the church. And that was a strong defense for the
Right.
not having female pastors.
Right.
The other thing, there was a sort of what I thought was a snide comment, but it said essentially that perhaps there's a supply and demand issue here, and that the increase in women pastors was harming the access for male pastors.
Oh, no. Okay.
Well, that's a good reason.
Yeah. You know, we lament, as we should lament, the loss of membership within the PCUSA. This week, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the old UPC USA and the old PCUS coming together in Atlanta to form the PCUSA, the old northern and southern branches. And when they did that, we had slightly over 3 million members. We now have 1 million some members. You know, that's pretty horrific. I saw that the SBC lost 500,000 last year. So part of what we need to look at are what are demographics that are happening across the board. So that's one thing, but on the other, this rise of the knowns is kind of what is swamping everything. And how do we approach that? Now, I did mention last week, Tim Keller. I probably mentioned him occasionally. Keller did kind of what I did early in my ministry. I started reading English theologians and missiologists who were dealing with what was happening in England and Europe in the post-war, post-Christian period, because the United States is 50 or 60 years behind what's going on there. But people like Leslie Newbegin this is terrific missiologist, had been a Church of England pastor in South India, and was writing about how to, have confidence in the gospel in a culture that is not supportive of the work of Christianity. And, how do you approach that? And Keller kind of imbued all of that stuff and took that into New York City. And I think it's really fascinating to watch that. But what I like so much about Keller is this Irenic spirit that he had, where everyone else is, be combative and everything. He's like, no, you got to do the work of Jesus and Jesus' way. And to me, that is a huge understanding of what is authentic about ministry. Yeah.
I still have a problem with Ted Keller. I still
Yeah.
think his stance against women and
Yeah.
his stance for complementarianism and against
Right.
the LGBTQ community, which you've done in writing, is indefensible.
I think that's fair.
Especially today.
Yeah.
I mean, we could maybe look at him historically and say he did some good things,
Yeah.
but we need to leave behind a lot of what he did.
Right.
Problematic and forward.
No question. I think, I could agree with probably 75% of the stuff, but that 25% is really, really problematic. And the complementarianism of that is something I don't see biblically. So that's kind of one of the places that we diverge. Well, good. Anything else for the good of the whole? Carol, you going to say something?
No.
Question.
Rosemary says we have one card
For Diane Neal.
for Diane Neal, who had a hip replacement yesterday.
In fact, that, quick question about organization. Didn't a lot of the Southern Baptist metropolitan churches leave and form kind of their own loose organizations, so they weren't considered any more part of Southern Baptist?
Yeah, in fact, I think Glendale may no longer be SBC. I'm not quite sure about
And
that.
I thought,
But there was, back in the 90s, conservatives came and really took over the SBC.
yeah,
And they made it essentially more narrowly doctrinal than I would argue the Presbyterian churches ever were when we had to bear allegiance to the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Westminster Standards. Very narrow. And so you had a flight out of the seminaries, out of colleges, of professors, and you had some churches that then became a new denomination. And I can't think of what it was called right now, but did pull out of the SBC because of that. Yeah,
I thought Emmanuel was one of those, Carol.
I don't know
I don't
about
think so, but
the
they
name.
did tell me they lost a lot of people to Brook Hollow Baptist, which I mean, I lived out there, Carol Ann did too. And they've become much more, kind of praise oriented, informal worship, which is, I think, appealing because, let's face it, we live in a consumer society and church has been one of the commodities
Right.
that you go and pick out and buy, so to speak.
Let me ask for Judith Larson, Cynthia Crane, Nan Holland, Sandra Crookshanks, Allie Hard, Carolyn Harris, and Dana Brooks. Can you all hear us better than last week?
We can hear you great. And just one thing, I was raised in the Baptist church, as was Doug. Excuse me. And my church today, still thriving, near the University of Richmond, is called River Road Church, Baptist. I'll tell you more about that when I can get in person one day. But they are members of the SBC and very progressive, but a different Baptist, formed in the 40s by a group of professors from the University of Richmond.
Yeah, it's why I thank you, Carol, or Sandra. I mean, I really, from the very beginning, we have Baptists who are of that strain, and we have kind of rural background. So it's hard to put a blanket statement on anything. Harry Emerson Fosdick, as I mentioned last week, was a Baptist. So, yeah.
I just have a question about two churches that I know of, one here and one in Texas. One has always been a Baptist church, and in recent years they've taken Baptist out of their name. And then Otter Creek, or used to be West End Church of Christ, I think. And in tiny print is Church of Christ,
Right.
but they've changed their name. Are they doing that to separate themselves from the denomination? Or are they doing that to appeal to people who don't want to be associated with the denomination?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks talk about, we're in an age, post-Constantinian, but also post-denominational. And so there was a time where, the brand meant something and we're gonna ride with the brand. And a lot of folks now are suggesting, bury that. That's not the important thing. It's about who you are as a congregation rather than who you are denominationally connected to. So that would be my sense. And I think Tony might know more about this than I, but Otter Creek has been a pretty strong church within the Church of Christ around here, maybe a little bit more progressive. Did they buy that and is that now sort of a satellite of Otter Creek Church?
Yes, they bought the property. West End Church of Christ had followed on our times, declining membership, all that sort of thing. It might be helpful to separate the term denomination from the Church of Christ, because technically every congregation within the body of the Church of Christ, or the fellowship of the Church of Christ, is totally independent. There is no governing body to say, okay, here's what we're going to do about female pastors. So every congregation makes its own decisions, and there's a certain amount of peer pressure, maybe, at least there has been in years past. The Otter Creek congregation is one of the more progressive churches of Christ in Nashville, maybe the whole country. And they're doing some rather different things, for the Church of Christ, like female elders and writing that sort of thing. Yes.
25 or 30 years ago, the West End Church of Christ was probably the most progressive, I dare I say, liberal Church of Christ in town, because they had this very fine pastor named Rural Shelley. And I read things that Clay Stoffer at Vine Street Christian, not Vine Street, Woodmont Christian, has written, saying that Rural Shelley was one of his mentors. Well, he was then for a while at a church out behind the out close to 100 Oaks, and bigger facility. And so I have a longtime friend who, she grew up in the Church of Christ, and she's very loyal to the denomination. Her husband was the son of a Church of Christ evangelist, and he won't darken the door of a church, period. But she went to West End Church of Christ for many years. And then when her kids got out of high school, she quit going to church. So last year she decided she was going to church. And she said it was like going into a foreign land. They had the big screens. They had what she considered a rock band up there, a lot of praise God and clap your hands and all of this. And she said, I did not know where I was. And and I said, well, why don't you come with me to church some Sunday? I said, it won't be any of that. And then it won't be, except for the fine music we have here. To your taste, but she is so ingrained in the Church of Christ that she could never set foot in this church unless it was for my funeral.
Yeah. Jump into this with the provocative title, John Wayne and save your ass.
Y'all been watching Shiny Happy People?
I watched the first of that. Yeah, thank you.
So, and the author is interviewed several times in that, and
Right.
also, talking about the Baptist churches, they mentioned that I forget what the acronym is, ILBP or whatever, the church, organization
Right.
that that group was part of, that a lot of Baptist churches took their teachings back in the nineties, so that might have been when they became more conservative.
All right, so, part of what she's tracing is what's happening politically, what's happening in society, and what's happening in theology and ecclesiology in the churches. So, and how these three streams kind of come together and impact. So I have to say, a little surprised at the first paragraph that we're starting off with Billy Graham's political leanings. And Billy Graham was a lifelong registered Democrat. And I wrote immediately on top of that, Southern Blue Dog Democrat, and then something else. Right,
Yellow dog.
Yellow Dog, right. Blue Dog is what Jim Cooper was.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But Yellow Dog, I wrote, and I think she does a really good job in talking about the change that all of that came around. How many of you remember Graham's flashy dressing phase? I love that. And it is helpful, I think, for us to think about the Stephanie is still in you're suggesting that
Which is saying to her, so much of this about Billy Graham is so new to me, because he wasn't in curriculum for me. And so all I knew was just the way he talked about Jesus and was so winsome. And so I've been like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So ask again if I love Billy Graham. I love Billy Graham, but do I appreciate him? No, my hands down this week.
Well, I tell you this much, it's really helpful to think, the span of his ministry.
Yeah.
And what was happening in the culture and all of those kinds of things. And so I think we also have to see how do people evolve. And he's getting seriously burned with Nixon. Seriously burned with Nixon. Changed how he related from that point forward with power, with political power. He was still kind of there, but he drew a line himself at that point. And so I do think it is really important to see and also appreciate how we grow. Do I hold the same positions today, theologically, politically, that I had when I entered ministry in, the mid-80s? So there's been evolution for me. And so, but it's also really important to think at what a phenomenon he was and how that got, how other people co-opt and connect and rise. And again, one of the other things that she's doing is showing how does that get marketed? How does that get put out in the culture as the normative expression and over and against other positions, right? So, he's our champion. He's our leader. Carol?
One thing I saw in this chapter in the first 2 or 3 pages, and I grew up a Baptist, so I have experience with this subject. Is that his ego got so big after the Los Angeles crusade that he had the audacity to say he wanted to meet with the President of the United States. And so Harry Truman let him come. But then, Harry Truman was not going to endorse him and his theology, I suppose, And the fact that he went out and gave a demonstration to the press of kneeling to the, after he had this conversation with Truman, I think that was a very learning experience in his career, because he said, well, whoever becomes the next president, I'm not going to make this mistake. I'm going to try to get on board with the candidates early on. And so that was fascinating to me, that he was able to get Eisenhower, who was probably less religious than Truman, to embrace his message, so to speak.
And of course, I'm here thinking, I'm really impressed that Graham would be so open to meet with this man who once made money playing piano at a brothel, right? Everybody remember that was the job that Harry was doing that? It's, you know, it's a wild ride. Look, you can come in and join one of the churches, you know, or you don't have to sit out there in the hallway. National Prayer Breakfast. There have been times where that's been a really big deal. It's been times where there's been pushback because it has been so dominated by the evangelicals that others of good faith don't feel connected there. One of the small footnotes is the person who got it started was Eugene Peterson's uncle.
Oh, interesting.
Which is a little thing I picked up in his biography, this fellowship, there are a couple of groups in DC that really work at developing kind of an evangelical underground. There was it was called The Family or something like that. There was a piece on Netflix I saw where kind of young staffers come in and older folks mentor them, and you know, all of that, and that's part of that. Midway through page 35, for evangelicals who believe that America was a Christian nation, the 1950s offers plenty of circumstantial evidence. More importantly, as a self-professed and loudest defenders of Christian America, evangelicals enhance their own cultural and political power. So we see that that growing. And then Eisenhower sees a possibility. And of course, what church did Eisenhower belong to?
Presbyterian. Must be
Presbyterian, National Pres. And interestingly, have any of you gone to his home out in Kansas? And it's really lovely. So Abilene, Kansas, right? I think that's where it is. I had a chance to stop there last year, and unfortunately, the house that he grew up in was under renovation, but there was a wonderful library and some other things. And there's a small chapel on the group that where he and Mamie and their one son are buried, and it is an exact copy in smaller version of National Presbyterian in Washington, D.C. Done by the same architect. I walked in there like, this was my church when I was in college. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah. Over at 36, as late as 52, the NAE had joined mainline groups in denouncing the nation's peacetime militarization, but by the end of the decade, the conflation of God and country and growing reliance on military might to protect both meant that Christian nationalism and evangelicalism itself would take on a decidedly militaristic bent.
Wasn't there a time earlier in American history when God and country were joined? Wasn't it during the Federalist period when they tried to do that?
Yeah, well, you know, you read, thank you, Lucky. Meacham has a great little book, I think, called The Soul of America, where he looks at the founding fathers and kind of the sort of checks and balances they put on religion. And there were times in the Federalist period, there was, you know, kind of a really evangelical revivalist movement around the Civil War. Certainly around the First World War, so that there are times and places. But the Red Menace and you know, combined also with the military industrial complex that was growing post-war, and of course, significantly in his last speech, Eisenhower warns against the military industrial complex, but it was certainly growing under his watch. Of course, you know, it had ramped up so substantially for the Second World War. You don't close all of that down, right? You know, so there's a place for it, and there are economic needs for it. And he talked about the rise of the Sun Belt evangelicals and sort of the power of that coming out of the Southeast. All right.
So guys, at the Constitutional Convention way back when, that we were creating a more perfect union, they specifically did not put in the Constitution a national language, and they did not put a national religion, because and the reason they didn't put either one of those is they knew they'd never get the votes in the convention from the 13 states to approve one or the other.
Good. It was really good having a historian in there. Middle of that page, the nuclear family structured around male breadwinner was in fact a recent invention, rising in the 20s and peaking in the 50s and 60s. Before then, multi-generational families relying on multiple contributions to the family economy had been the norm.
Yes.
And part of that was living in farm communities and all of those kinds of things. Any pushback from that paragraph, or? No, good.
That was totally new to me.
Uh,
I had never thought about that.
I think part of that goes with the kind of rural economies.
Makes sense.
And, you know, you might live on a multi-generational farm and things like that. And then, you know, you read The Jungle, Sinclair Lewis's book about the meatpacking industry. And so the new urbanism and, you know, challenge of all of that, but even within the real tenement buildings in New York City. You ever get to New York City, one of the museums I invite you to go to is that tenement. Have you ever been there, Carol?
I've taken school
Yeah.
here.
And, you know, you realize that everybody in the family's working, right? It's not just this function.
Yeah, there are some chat notes on there. I'm not sure what the term. Yeah, they might be really good.
Allie Hart says, good morning all. Somebody else says, yes, can hear you better, hearing better. Did you see that the National Prayer Quest has ended being sponsored by the Fellowship, the Family Foundation, and will be sponsored by Congress going forward? I did not. Allie, I thought it was interesting how in a relatively short period of time, evangelical opinion changed from perceiving the military as a place of moral corruption for young men to a place held in high esteem with Christian ideals. Yeah. And frankly, one of the real surprises to me, last year, I went through Arlington Cemetery, went to pay my respects to one of my former professors who's buried there. But I had heard an article about this, and if you go out to the National Cemetery west of town, which I do on Memorial Day, and the headstones, you know, you used to see either crosses or stars of David. Well, now you see Thor's hammer. You see all of these. What they allow for religion is much wider than it historically had been.
Yeah.
And I've read about these kind of multi-dimensional things. A number of years ago, there was a big issue at the Air Force Academy over the kind of evangelicalism that was kind of being forced on people there. I might be able to pull some of that. She may reference it later in the book. I'm only reading this a chapter or two at time, so I'm not as far ahead, but I do think that that's interesting. The bottom of 36, I think is really important, and then over to 37. The civil rights movement, Vietnam, and feminism would all challenge reigning dogmas. And for evangelicals who had found a sense of security and significance in an America that affirmed traditional gender roles, a strong national defense, and confidence in American power, the sense of loss would be acute. But conservative evangelicals were not about to relinquish their newfound power. They would not go down without a fight. In various ways, each of these disruptions challenged the authority of white men. In the 1960s and 70s then, conservative evangelicals would be drawn to a nostalgic, rugged masculinity as they look to reestablish white patriarchal authority in its many guises. Over time, the defense of patriarchy and growing embrace of militant masculinity would come to define both substance and symbol of evangelical culture and political values. What do you all think about that?
Happening today. That's right.
Yeah, we were talking about it before you came in, just how it's very helpful to read this and then read the newspaper and kind of see what's going on.
Well, and there, as our demographics are changing, we're assuming a minority majority.
Right.
I know people who are white males that are a little upset about that and concerned.
Yeah, very helpful point. Everybody here saying that as demographics are changing and the browning of America is happening, there are men who are feeling conflicted about that. I can tell you, I don't know if I mentioned this at one point, but I used to take a day trip with Jim Hartman or an overnight trip with Jim Hartman, where we would fly somewhere, go to an art museum, and then fly home. So we, you know, the first time we did it, we caught a 6 a.m. flight out of here to Chicago. You know, it was like a $50 flight. It cost us $100 to fly to coming back, maybe on the plane. And we got in the Midway. We took the subway into a block from the Art Institute, had a cup of tea. We were the first in line when the museum opened. We left when it closed. We went back and we flew home. It was great. I mean, that's a good day for God. Now, Hartman had never been to the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm like, but we're going. When we got on the train from Midway into Chicago, we were the only Caucasian men on that train. Now, it wasn't just African Americans, it just wasn't Latinos, it just wasn't Asian, it's all. And I felt like the first time, okay, I get this. This isn't my experience in West Nashville. I had a buddy of mine from Chicago, or from Minnesota. He had been the music director of my church in Illinois, come and visit here, and he said, when we're driving around, where are all the black people? Well, that's the one. Right? So part of that is the communities in which we live and our ability to kind of see and sense what's happening in the wider world, right? It was poignant to me in the same way when I was an undergraduate in DC. I worked with the Sojourner community in Washington a little bit, doing politics of hunger seminars for folks from around the country. And I would occasionally ride the bus in the parts of the town where we had feeding centers, and I would be the only Caucasian on the bus. And I would consciously think to myself, when I was getting dressed that morning, I better not put that, how do I dress down? And one time I found myself reading the biography of Malcolm X on the, I'm like, this is a good thing or not. But my point was, it is so instructive to be the minority in a situation. I'm not a good golfer, right? John, if you ever took me out, you would like be over the moon about how bad a golfer I am. I tell folks I don't have a handicap, I am the handicap. But Ben Kane and I used to go out and play Ted Rhodes occasionally. And I love playing Ted Rhodes because it's the only time I've ever been on a golf course where I'm the minority. There are all those TCU and Fisk, you know, fraternity guys who are old duffers now out there. And, you know, I think putting ourselves in those kind of situations are very, very helpful. Yeah.
You know, I taught in Harlem, it was my first teaching assignment, I graduated from Columbia, and my mentor was a woman who grew up in the neighborhood. And the first thing that happened when I was about to start teaching the very first day was that Al Shanker, who was then head of the Teachers Union in New York, pulled the teachers out on strike. And my mentor said to me, we have to go to work because our children have no place to go. So I was the only white teacher in the school. And let me tell you, the other experience I had having worked in Harlem and then having also been the youth group advisor to a Methodist church in the South Bronx was that the Black people treat us a whole lot better than we treat them. When my mentor and I would go to lunch in Harlem, everybody was just as nice to me as they could be. They were kind, they were fine, they treated me just like my mentor. When we went downtown, where I used to eat, she was always treated as if she must be my nurse or something, you know, I mean, it was a very different experience.
Right.
And that's what you really need to remember, that they do not feel, if you're a minority, it doesn't feel the same.
Right.
And the other place I've been that's different is Oakland. Oakland, everybody accepts everybody. When my son got married, and we went to his wedding out there, somebody at my table said, I think we're the only mono-ethnic couple at this wedding. And then I said, no, those two guys. And he said, well, Sheffy. I mean,
Thanks, Chevy.
I would call me up, Jean's daughter, and said, you know, so-and-so's daddies are gonna do so-and-so, and so-and-so's mommies are gonna go work in Washington, and they don't think a thing about it. They really don't, it's not something unusual to them at all. They're growing up thinking the world is gonna be like this, and I think, oh, my Lord.
Yeah. Ken?
The civil rights movement and Vietnam had big divides. Some ministers would come out in favor of demilitarization, some churches. Did that segregate our populations more, that period of time, saying, I like the Presbyterian Church, but they're in favor, our pastor is in favor of civil rights, and I'm losing my power, so I'm going to move to a Baptist church? Or did people move into the Presbyterian Church because they felt the action on Vietnam was appropriate for them?
I don't have statistics to draw on that. I have some anecdotal stuff. My dad, when the Presbyterian Church came out in support of Angela Davis, some of you may be old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
That was about the only time, and of course, my dad was a judge, like he was about ready to leave. And it was an amicus brief in support of her and her rights and all of that. And, I mean, folks just about lost their cool over that. I grew up in a steel town, and you know, a lot of execs were members of the congregation, and pressure around the war was not insubstantial there. I do think that there were probably some of that, but my sense is, you know, a lot of the folks were also leaving institutions over Vietnam, so it was kind of everything that represented institutions were problematic. Next Wednesday night, I'm going to show that Jesus Revolution here. I would love for any of you who can to come and watch that with me, and especially for those of you who kind of lived through and saw the Jesus freedom and the hippies and all of that. I mean, I think that was really powerful, and just, you know, I had some touch of that, but not completely. And of course, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was not, you know, South Los Angeles kind of deal. But I think those kind of movements movements and what was that like, for folks who were rejecting so much of culture and yet not rejecting Christ, and coming into those churches that were so rigidly enculturated and changing them? I think it was really significant. Yes.
That's at 7.
Yeah, the movie will start at 7. We'll, if you want to come and bring a brown bag dinner, you can do that about 6:15. Well, let's keep moving. I do think, Lost Cause and Cynthia Crane is on. Cynthia, can you tell us what the name of your high school was in Richmond, Virginia? Cynthia, are you there? You're muted, Cynthia. Have you gone away to take care of your dog? Her high school is either Robert E. Lee.
Here I am.
Was it the Douglas Southpaw Freeman High School?
Yes. And we were the Mighty Rebels. And our fight song was Dixie, of course. And it was when I was in high school there, it was the first year that any African-American students were in the school. And so it was an amazing time. And they have since changed everything about their Confederate flag going through at pep rallies and the Dixie and all those things. And they're now, I think they're called the Ravens or something like that.
Thank you. Other than Carol, who knows who Douglas Southpaw Freeman is?
I do.
Who was the I do? Douglas Southpaw Freeman was the editor of a newspaper in Richmond. And then he wrote a biography of Lee, and then wrote a work called Lee's Lieutenants. And these were kind of quiet defenses of the lost cause. But this veneration of Southern gentlemen, warriors, Lee and all, I mean, it's right out of there. I read those. I got them at a used bookstore when I was 12, read every page of them, and, you know, totally bought into it. Grant wasn't my hero, but the Southern generals were. I mean, it was powerful. And so when we read over on 37, to white Americans who were willing to listen, the civil rights movement argued that America had never been a country of liberty and justice for all. The evangelical left were vocal supporters of civil rights. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the lost cause of the Confederate South had blended with Christian theology to produce the distinctly Southern variation of civil religion, one that upheld Robert E. Lee as a patron saint. I recently read a book on Herbert Hoover. How's that for a wasted afternoon? But what was really helpful in that book was this little side note of tracing the beginnings of the KA fraternity. The founding chapter was in 1865 in W&L, and was absolute veneration of Lee and that Southern gentleman and you know, taking care of the women folk and all of that. Well, Herbert Hoover got sucked into that when he was at George Washington as an undergraduate, and got to know the leaders of that. And that kind of argument was right on line with what our author is saying here about the connection of all of those things together. Most Northern evangelicals, like Graham, many were cautious supporters of early years. Yet Graham was wary about moving too fast. He urged the Supreme Court to proceed with caution to quell extremists on both sides. Then that next paragraph, at the same time, moderate proponents of civil rights began to cool in their support for further action. Graham, for example, withdrew his backing as activists began to engage in civil disobedience and demand further government intervention. Many evangelicals followed his lead, concluding that it was not the role of government to interfere in issues of racial justice, only Jesus could change human hearts. Many evangelicals who found it hard to accept that the sin of racism ran deep through the nation's history. To concede this seemed unpatriotic, having embraced the idea of America as a Christian nation. It was hard to accept a critique of the nation as fundamental that advanced by the civil rights movement. I think that is really on point. And frankly, I read on MLK weekend every year, letter from the Birmingham jail. Why do I do that? Because I know in my heart and looking at the mirror, I would have been one of those pastors that said, slow down. There's a process to this. Let's not get too crazy in the streets, right? I feel absolutely convicted by that every year. And I think it's necessary for us to face up to that, right? Understanding this in key word here, ambivalence towards civil rights within white evangelicalism is key to understanding the role that race would play within evangelical politics more generally. By backing away from their support for civil rights, evangelicals like Graham ended up giving cover to more extremist sentiments within the insurgent religious right. Very important. One of the keys to the break off of the PCA was, scripture spiritual, not political. But that was a cover for how are we dealing with this issue in the country, and I still hear that today. Ken?
Just recently, if this book were to go into one of the public libraries or one of the school libraries, would this sort of statement make it have to come out because it's blaming
White folks.
white folks?
Yeah, exactly. This is just absolutely crazy. And the sense, well, I'm a Christian, I don't participate in that, or we're a Christian country, and therefore,
When Ken and I were traveling recently in Tennessee, we came across like a little local newspaper. And the interesting lead article was what your children will not be taught in Tennessee. And it went right into this, explaining the history, anything unpleasant in terms of battles or stands or whatever is now out of the history curriculum.
Right.
I mean, we could see it right down to 8th grade, what a grandchild is not going to read or be taught.
Yeah. And are you and Ken then doing private classes with your grandchild?
Yes.
Because
They don't attend.
Gonna go flunk them.
I got them, but they don't show up often.
Yeah. Over at the end of 39, some proponents of Christian masculinity praised Confederate generals and defended the institution of slavery, but for many, the racial subtext was more subtle. Invariably, however, the heroic Christian man was a white man, and not infrequently a white man who defended against the threat of non-white men and foreigners. And how does that get played out in the cultural markers of that period and film? How many of you know what if I get this right, what was the national book winner in like 60 or 61? Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. And part of that book is about somebody who doesn't have an identity, so he goes to movies to kind of try to figure out his identity. Well, what movies were we watching during that period? And frankly, the kind of movies I grew up with in the 60s, and guys who were just a little bit older than me watching those same movies that go on to Vietnam. There was a whole lot of that. Pepperdine College, now he gets it, the connection between white masculine power, family values, politics, and militant defense of Christian America was on clear display in the early 60s in Southern California, the center of popular culture. Pepperdine College, I think this whole thing was really important in certainly taking on or worried about Kennedy's Catholicism, and some of you remember that he was soft on communism, and then Barry Goldwater. My mother was a Goldwater fan. My folks were Republicans, but that's not good. But my mother was all about Barry.
That people remember that 1960 election, watching it on the convention on your black and white TV, and then the Southern Baptists were really worried about this whole thing, that he was a Catholic, my grandmother in particular, because they all felt the Pope would be running the church. And so he, Greg, went to this big Baptist thing down in Houston and said, if I have to choose between my faith and my job, I will choose my faith and resign. And that made my grandmother vote for him.
Right. I think this is really important. Goldwater seemed the perfect antidote to Kennedy, and conservative evangelicals were drawn to this hard-edged, bombastic style and to the quote cowboy conservatism he embodied. So she's really trying to trace some of this in a very particular way. There's another book, I'm sorry.
She's doing a good job too.
Yeah, there's another book that I have that from just a purely political sense was doing this, looking at Goldwater, who was around Goldwater, and then bringing Reagan in and so forth. So it's
Ashley just has a new note up here, and I'll affirm what she has written.
on the next page for his 1958 Senate campaign poster. Goldwater stood rifle in hand in buckskin jacket and cowboy hat, and in public appearances he liked to conjure the aura of heroic cowboy standing against all odds, refusing to compromise. Goldwater wasn't known for his religious beliefs, but it wasn't really the point. And I just wrote Andy over. Yeah, exactly. Well, and one of the other things that we have to remember about this period is it wasn't only Southern California, but the West. What made the Southwest bloom?
What made the Southwest what?
Bloom in the 60s.
Blue.
2 words:
Hoover down?
air conditioning.
Oh.
Air conditioning. But so Goldwater goes out there, and of course he was an Air Force general, but he was a big Air Force guy. Yeah.
He also had a poster that had a nuclear explosion behind him,
Yeah.
which I thought was very scary.
I bet. When did you all start voting? Which election? 64, 68?
60.
60. Okay.
You could vote at 18 back then.
At 18, yeah.
I thought I did.
But you were at least aware of what was happening. Yeah. Then Pastor Bob Wells, Central Baptist Church, Heritage High, dedicated to Christian Americanism. That very bottom at the end, one drama, God of Our Fathers, contained inspirational words from Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee. It's interesting to put those 2 guys together. And General MacArthur. From the Patriots football team, the school floats with students dressed in Union, Confederate, and World War II flag. So soldiers all raising the flag at Iwo Jima. The school was steeped in mythical militant past. I didn't realize that Knott's Berry Farm had that kind of background. Yeah. Goldwater's truculent style and aggressive foreign policy went hand in hand with his cowboy mystique. Goldwater won only Arizona and 5 southern states, losing Johnson in one of the biggest landslides in American political history. And it is interesting, I think, to compare and contrast his style to Eisenhower's style. Right? Eisenhower really appealed to the broad middle. He always worried about the John Birchers and all of that, and he's clearly Republican, but it really is a different style. Goldwater's defeated over on 44. However, vast a political realignment already underway. Although Griffith refrained from supporting Goldwater in 64, he claimed to have received over 1 million telegrams urging him to do so. 4 years later, the choice would be easier. Nixon, that lapsed Quaker. Do you remember the scene from Ken Burns's show on country music about when the Grand Ole Opry moved out to the new location? Nixon came and played.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And there were, signs, and so the suggestion with Burns was culturally, country music was connected with this sort of more conservative movement. And, we've seen in our own time when folks like the Dixie Chicks have stepped up, or I read this week that Garth Brooks is going to continue to serve Bud Light in his bar downtown. And he's getting all kind of blowback. Who knew that beer would be a cultural issue? But I guess it is.
What's wrong with Bud Light?
It is seen that evidently there were commercials put out by Bud Light that
Right.
either support or privilege gay relate for bride.
Oh, okay.
Stuff for bride.
it was a trans.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear you.
One of the spokesmen, one of the commercials, I had been slow.
Oh, one of the spokespersons for Bud Light was a trans person.
That's
so.
right.
Buck, you'll-
I have a fun fact here on page 44, that last paragraph, John R. Rice. He moved to Murfreesboro. And if you've ever gone down 96 from Franklin to Murfreesboro, you'll see this farm. And the gate, whatever else, and that's where he went.
We remember that election, the so-called silent majority, white evangelicals were a significant part of this majority. Nixon's faith was shaped by a Western strand of Quakerism. Did any of you know that there were sort of different strands of Quakerism?
No.
I didn't know it until I went to seminary. At college, I got interested in Quakerism and would occasionally attend Quaker worship. And I used to say, it would be great, except it's missing a couple of hymns and a good sermon. Other than that, all that silence is a really good thing. But, at seminary, seeing a couple of guys from the West, their Quaker services were preached. But then there was a period of silence after the preached word. And then people would, and I'm like, yeah, they could go have roast preacher for lunch. I don't want to hear that right after I preach, But then we get into Charles Colson. Nixon knew how to speak the language of evangelicals and how to appeal to their values through symbol and spectacle. Little marginal note there. Do you remember one of his other cronies who went on to become a Presbyterian minister? Jeb Stuart Magruder. Went to Princeton Seminary and had a church in Cincinnati or Louisville or something like that, and mayor or something like that. Anyway, we've had some problems, but we're beginning to come together under God, Griffith concurred. It was time to wave the flag with pride. Old George McGovern, I think it's really interesting that both George and Herbert Hoover were sons of pastors. Am I remember that right about?
Yeah.
Hoover, wasn't he son of a Lutheran pastor?
Hoover was an orphan.
I mean, not Hoover, Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey, right? From Minnesota.
He was from Minnesota, but I
Yeah.
don't know if he was a son of a
I
minister.
think he was the son of a Lutheran pastor. I'll run that down, but I think that's right.
I'm sort of mystified by how. Like, I'm reading about the governor, I've heard about him, and this is all before I was born, so, you know, but like, I'm reading the description of him and thinking. How did faithful people not gravitate towards him, if they gravitate towards this bombastic. Gun waving, bombing, it just seems, I'm really mystified. Yes, I think I'm being now, and I mean, I just don't, it really boggles my.
It does, but again, I think what's really helpful is how culturally captive do we get? And if part of the narrative of that period is we've got to support the troops and this is escalating and all of that, how do we see?
They conflated Christianity with the military, and those are two.
Right, right,
But not,
yeah,
yeah, but not always, not always.
but not always.
Yeah, no, I was in, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I didn't raise my hand.
That's all right.
Okay. I know, I'm sorry. I was in Georgia for 9 years at, where formerly Fort Benning is. And I was, a lot was opened up for me down there, because I grew up in Illinois in a little small town close to Springfield, Illinois, and kind of traveled all over sort of the northern south and up into the north. And so this was like totally new for me. It was really interesting to see how the military was just so embraced, because I hadn't experienced that before. And I just couldn't believe, like, the idolatry of it. I hadn't seen that firsthand before, and it was really amazing to me.
And I do think it is interesting because you have an experience with the military yourself. Your husband was a naval physician, and you lived on base and all of that kind of stuff. So and you know, your son will get God and Country awards, right? In the badges for their scouting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my son's doing that.
You know, and so, you know, where do we parse all of that?
Yes.
But in the 70s, it was very, very hard. Again, if you've not watched that Ken Burns documentary on country music, the ones in the 60s and 70s do a fabulous job, I think, showing kind of this tension, because Earl Scruggs, you know, goes up or was it Scruggs or the other one? Who were the Scruggs and Flat and Scruggs? One of them goes with his sons and Charlie Daniels and plays at the March on Washington. And the other one is All God and Country, and they sort of break up over some of that. It's really, really interesting. George, you want to say something?
I always thought that governor was the Democratic nomination, was the product of the '68 convention in Chicago. Because the one of the things that happened was in '72 was the daily delegates from Chicago were unseated right at the convention, so the whole thing was in chaos.
Yeah. And of course, I seem to remember his running mate then had some issues because it was found out that he had some psychiatric. Remember that?
Right.
It was a senator from Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah, electroshock therapy for an episode of depression, which was sort of standard of care.
Eagleton, I think his name was.
Eagleton, that's right.
Now I'm remembering this from being a 12-year-old. Okay, so.
After the convention, during the campaign, the party had to replace the vice presidential nominee on the ticket.
They carried one state though, you know that.
Which state, was it South Dakota or?
One of the Dakotas.
Yeah, I think it was South
Well,
Dakota.
that was where the government was from.
Right,
That's right.
Campus Crusade and Bill Bright, and then by quote, media strategy. I think this media strategy and this very careful work, kind of a business work, is gonna be important, to see.
I mean, you could call it the Christian industrial complex.
Yeah. Jim Wallace and other members of the People Christian Coalition, were pushing back on that. But it wasn't to be over the top of 48. Christian version of popular music paved way for what will become a thriving contemporary Christian music industry. Expanding world of evangelical popular culture would offer an ideal conduit for disposal and reinforcement of conservative politics. Now, just a little sidebar, there were other things going on at the time culturally. There was a group called Up With People that came popular during this time. Now, I have somebody very close to me, for whom in the 80s being part of Up With People was probably the most significant experience of her life. Amy joined that right out of college for a year, traveled, loved the songs about unity and everything. But when it started, it was very clearly, we want to show young people who are not the hippies that are singing these songs with bright, shiny faces. I don't want to use that from the show, but I mean, it was clearly came out of that tradition. And there have been some movies made about that Amy absolutely hates. But all right, yes, the anti-war left, though often disparaged by the evangelical, was in fact animated by part of religious faith. And this is something, that is so important for us to remember. Carl McIntyre shows back up. Christianity Today, Carl Henry and Jerry Falwell. I think this is important, the bottom of 49. When confronted with undeniable evidence of American brutality, evangelicals can always fall back on the concept of human depravity. With sin lurking in every man's heart, violence was inevitable, and only Jesus was the answer. When the young Army Lieutenant William Calley faced trial for his role in the murder of some 500 Vietnamese men, women, and children in what came to be known as the My Lai massacre, Billy Graham remarked that he had, quote, never heard of a war where innocent people are not killed, end quote. He told two of, quote, horrible stories, end quote, he heard from missionaries of, quote, sadistic murders of Viet Cong, and he reminded Americans that Vietnamese women and children had planted booby traps and mutilated American soldiers. His moral reflection in the pages of the New York Times was remarkably banal. I think that's really kind of important, that they're kind of the, one of the ways that we deal with this is it's not a societal problem. There's not a cultural force, but it's only the individual's heart. And some of us who have studied the melee, that no officers above them were at all held accountable. And of course, what stopped that massacre was a soldier flying a helicopter who actually put his helicopter down between Calley's men and the civilians. And he was the one who made sure that people knew that this had happened. But it's really an incredible story of courage of that helicopter pilot and his forcing that to go. Yeah. This abandonment of Christian just war theory and the Geneva Conventions. Vietnam was pivotal to the formation of emergent evangelical identity. The war was a watershed moment for American Christians. Some of you lived through this, right?
Right.
I just need to shut up because I can't imagine how challenging it would have been to be a pastor through that season. 72, West Point conferred the Thayer Award due to honor country upon Billy Graham. Still, within evangelicalism, a small contingent of outspoken critics Senator Mark Hatfield, remember him from Missouri? His daughter went to Princeton University, and I got to know her when I was in seminary.
I thought he was from, I think he was from
Or
Oregon.
from Oregon. Who's the one that I'm thinking of that was the Episcopal priest from Missouri? Remember, he was a senator and an Episcopal priest from Missouri. Danforth. Right, Danforth.
Oh, John Dan.
John Danforth. I got to know his daughter when she was an undergraduate.
Became the president of Washington University.
Yeah, really impressive guy. The evangelical left, however, failed to convince most fellow evangelicals that their faith required a critique of patriarchy and American power. And we see this, the kind of roots of this stream within evangelicalism as being in conversation. If you read that article that I sent from David Brooks, that's where this comes up, right? So there's a conflict and a split within the evangelical camp. A common evangelical heritage and shared theological commitments diminished in significance as Christian nationalism, militarism, and gender traditionalism came to define conservative evangelical identity and dictate ideological allies. But this was, to your point, Ken, I was mentioning earlier, in the 60s, Americans economically, but thanks to a thriving post-war economy, growing numbers of evangelicals were moving into the middle and upper middle class. And with that came education, but this nostalgic celebration of rugged masculinity would come to symbolize a shared identity and a political agenda. I thought in this paragraph that starts the Vietnam War was foreign policy crisis and domestic one, and how we felt when Schwarzkopf went in the first Gulf War and ended that so quickly. Remember? I mean, it was like all of the nightmares of Vietnam are over, and our military is back. And I'm telling you how I felt, right? Not this. There's enough of me that I see in these pages that this analysis I think is really fine. But golly, that that what we pulled off in that coalition and did so. I mean, I'm watching that and thinking, thankfully the nightmare of Vietnam is over, and the military is back, able to do what we're supposed to do. Does that resonate with any of you? Sure. I mean, it certainly did for me. All right, then we get over this militant application of patriarchal authority. I'm over on 54. Piles championed this vision of aggressive and violent masculinity. Religious and secular conservatives at the time, the two would become difficult to distinguish as red-blooded American manhood became infused with God and country virtues. What do y'all think about that? Yeah.
It's still going on in Georgia because the governor got elected, Governor Kemp down there with his commercials of him holding a rifle.
Yeah.
That's rugged male and individuality, God and country. And military.
Andy Ogles.
Right, same here. Now he gets off from preaching into meddling when he's getting to John Wayne's films. Because I know for John's work review, you like those films.
Yeah.
Alamo and Good Ray, I thought her analysis of both of those were really, actually, really insightful. Where am I? Over on 56 now. However, the war heroes Wayne played left recruits ill prepared for the realities of war. On screen, good triumphed over evil, and the lines between the two were clearly drawn. War was a place where boys became men and men became heroes, where America was a force for good, and where American ends justified any means. shipped overseas, new recruits soon learned that real war fell far short of this ideal. I had two cousins who were in and they were a stunning contrast. My cousin John played lacrosse at Lafayette and then went to Michigan Law School. Was sent to military intelligence and was in the first class from Hollywood to be sent directly into Vietnam. And he was there at 68 for the Tet Offensive. My cousin Jerry went in as an 18-year-old and was a door gunner on Huey helicopters, served a term and a half, so was in country for 18 months. John, my older cousin, who later became an assistant attorney general of Maryland, never could shake the ambivalence of his experience over there. Had guilt, my cousin Jerry wraps himself in the flag. There was nothing we did wrong. And, you know, I actually tried to engage in some conversation after Burns's film on Vietnam. And couldn't go there. I mean, nothing we did was wrong. You know, so I think it's interesting how their ages, their educational experience, all of that gave them different perspectives over there. What do you all think at the bottom of 54? To begin with, Wayne's masculinity was unapologetically imperialist. All of Wayne's greatest hits involved valiant white men battling and usually subduing non-white populations, the Japanese, Native Americans, or Mexicans. Like Teddy Roosevelt, Wayne's rugged masculinity was realized through violence, and it was distinctly white male ideal. This was not lost on his fans. In '77, on occasion of Wayne's 70th birthday, an article in the conservative journal Human Events attempted to explain Wayne's allure, and the realized portrait of Wayne is revealing. What do you all think about that?
I mean, this is awful.
I mean, I'm looking at it from the lens of the film in 2023, and I realize this is a product at the time, and so I mean, I'm cognizant of that. But like, you could not do this today, nor should you, nor should we celebrate. I think we need to make sure that when we talk about him, we don't venerate him, even though he was a product of the time. I mean, because like I'm reading this and I'm going, he's justifying having a black actor as a slave and other disabilities and all of a sudden I'm like, you know, I will admit, I've never watched a Conway movie and I'm not going to start.
What, have you watched Rambo films?
No.
Okay, because it occurred to me that some of the same kind of critique
Yeah.
could be made at that.
Yes. It's still out there.
Oh, it is absolutely. This is Norman.
And how about Charlton Heston holding up the rifle and saying, out of these dead hands will they take this rifle?
Exactly. Well, I wouldn't be surprised, Cynthia, if we get to him in another chapter. Roberta, you're gonna say something.
Well, I was just gonna say, and I think that there are a lot of people in this room that this is true about, but I feel like I'm kind of a bridge between the two, you know, ways of thinking, having grown up with John Wayne and all this. And now I feel like I'm trying so hard to be more progressive and, you know, open to humanity and all like that. But I can relate to so much of this because I lived through it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And not only lived through it, we're inspired by it, right?
Well, and personally, I have to say, I think it's affected a lot of the earlier things, affected my first marriage, you know, just the way that society placed men and women, you know, and all like that.
And how in the 70s, when things were coming apart and were getting renegotiated, you know, I don't know that my parents' marriage would have survived had my mother lived, right?
Well, I understand that.
I mean, I just think, you know, my dad was born in 21 and was expecting certain things. And, you know, my mom, who had been an Army nurse in the Second World War and had gone back to work and was back in graduate school, was moving in a different direction, and, I think it was incredibly challenging, during that period.
Well, and one other thing I was gonna say is that, I was raised in a typically male-oriented, family. Went to church every Sunday, Presbyterian. But I can remember very distinctly my father looking at me and saying, always, always vote Republican. And I often think, well, I hope you're not rolling over in your grave. I'm not following your instructions.
But what's interesting is back then, voting Republican, they had meant something very different.
That's right. That's
Than it was today. And I keep telling Amy, she was very proud that her family was Democrat. And I'm like, okay, let's take a look at what Democrat meant in the South
Yes, right.
in, before 68.
Yeah.
That there was and then all of a sudden, I think the book does a good job is how do the Republicans post 68 with Nixon's Southern strategy and all of that, how does race get involved in that in substantial ways when LBJ and others took the Democratic Party in a different place on race? And I would argue, gosh, did anybody see that Bob Gottlieb died? Just broke my heart. Now, some of you may not know that name. He was the editor of the New Yorker, but more importantly, he was the editor of Bob Caro's books on LBJ. And there was a movie that recently came out that showed the two of them because Caro is such a incredibly intense biographer. What was originally to be 3 volumes on LBJ is 4, and he's in his 80s and he hasn't finished the 5th volume. And Gottlieb, who was in his early 90s, was his editor. It's a fabulous movie if you can see it. It's just wonderful. Yeah, George.
I was gonna say, I just read volumes 3 and 4, and I hope he lives long enough to finish 5.
All of us do. It's like brother. Yeah, just two last things, and I gotta run. I've got a wedding in Chattanooga that I gotta get to, and as I said, I totally forgot about farming and traffic. The words of the Baptist scholar Alan Bean, the unspoken mantra of post-war evangelicalism was simple: Jesus can save your soul, but John Wayne can save your life.
Yeah.
But brothers and sisters, that's worth the price of admission. Another sort of history before this time, Broken Churches, Broken Nation by Gomes, Dominational Schisms and the Coming of the Civil War. Good little read. Thank you all for your willingness to wrestle with this. I think, we will see mirrors of ourselves and where we were. And for you all who lived through the 60s and the 70s, who had to make some hard choices about which side, we're going to go on. I'm a little younger. I didn't have that, but I am so sensitive to how difficult that would be. And I do think we take so much of our culture in without ever looking at it, without ever analyzing it. And, there's good and there's bad, and how do we go for that? So anyways, bless you all. Thanks. Thank you all for checking in.
I know you got it done, but.